The morning Emma stopped speaking began like any other morning in their modest two-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Denver. Her mother, Sarah, had made pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse ears, Emma's favorite. The 3-year-old sat in her high chair, syrup dripping down her chin, giggling at the silly shapes. Sarah watched her daughter with the fierce love only a mother knows, smoothing back Emma's golden curls and pressing a kiss to her forehead. Emma was the light of Sarah's life, her reason for waking up each day, her greatest accomplishment, her most precious treasure. They lived a quiet, humble life. Sarah worked as a medical assistant at a local clinic, and Emma attended 3 days a week. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. That evening, as darkness crept over Denver and the city lights began to twinkle against the purple sky, everything changed. Sarah's ex-partner, Michael, had been a violent man. Their relationship had ended 3 years ago, right around the time Sarah discovered she was pregnant with Emma. She'd gathered her courage, her dignity, and what little money she had, and she'd left him. For 3 years he'd stayed away, restrained by a protective order, warned by police to maintain distance. But some men don't accept rejection. Some men believe they own what they've touched. Michael had begun to spiral in recent months, drinking heavily, losing his job, growing increasingly unstable. He'd violated the protective order twice before, lingering outside Sarah's workplace, showing up at the grocery store, but he'd always slipped away before police arrived. On that terrible November night, he didn't slip away. Emma had been sleeping soundly in her small bedroom, her favorite stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm, when the first sound startled the household. Sarah was reading in bed, a cup of chamomile tea cooling on her nightstand when she heard the angry pounding on the front door. Before she could even process what was happening, Michael's voice boomed through the apartment, no longer pleading or charming but dark and menacing. "Sarah, open this door. We need to talk." Sarah's blood turned to ice. She immediately moved toward Emma's room, her protective instincts overriding her fear. She locked the door behind her and scooped her sleeping daughter into her arms, whispering reassurances she didn't feel. "It's okay, baby. Mommy's here. Everything's fine." Emma stirred briefly, confused by the commotion, but didn't fully wake. Sarah dialed 911 with trembling fingers, but before the operator could even answer her call, Michael broke through the front door. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the small apartment like a gunshot. What happened next would be burned into Emma's memory forever, even though she was only 3 years old. Sarah barricaded herself and Emma in the bedroom, phone still pressed to her ear, desperately begging the 911 operator to send help. Michael pounded on the bedroom door with the fury of a madman, screaming obscenities and threats. Emma, now fully awake and terrified, began to cry, a small, confused wail that broke Sarah's heart even as she held her tight. "It's okay, baby. Mommy's got you. The police are coming," Sarah kept repeating, more to convince herself than her daughter. Then came the moment that would silence Emma for years to come. Michael kicked the bedroom door open, and in his hand was a knife, a long, gleaming kitchen knife that caught the lamplight. Sarah saw the weapon and made a split-second decision. She pushed Emma behind her, using her own body as a shield, and screamed with a ferocity that surprised them both. The struggle was violent and chaotic. Michael lunged at Sarah, the knife slashing through the air. Emma watched from her hiding spot behind the bed, her tiny eyes wide with an incomprehensible horror, as her mother, the woman who braided her hair and sang lullabies and made Mickey Mouse pancakes, fought for their lives. Police sirens wailed outside, growing louder and louder. Michael hesitated for only a moment, but it was enough. Sarah managed to create distance between them, and within seconds armed officers burst into the apartment. The scene that unfolded was chaos and urgency. Michael was tackled to the ground, the knife clattering away. Officers screamed commands. Radios crackled. And through it all, Emma stood frozen in her pink pajamas, watching as handcuffs were placed on her mother's wrists. In the confusion and trauma of the moment, Sarah was arrested too, not for any crime she'd committed, but because the situation was complicated. She had injuries consistent with self-defense, But in the heat of the moment and with incomplete information, officers detained her for questioning. Emma watched her mother being led away by uniformed officers, just as she watched Michael being similarly restrained. To a 3-year-old mind, incapable of understanding the nuances of law and justice, it appeared that both her mother and the scary man were being taken away. Both were criminals. Both were dangerous. Both were gone. Emma was taken to the hospital for a physical evaluation, where doctors confirmed she was unharmed but deeply traumatized. Child Protective Services was contacted, and within hours, Emma was placed in the temporary custody of her grandmother, Sarah's mother, who lived across town. Arrived at the hospital frantic with worry and confusion, pulling her granddaughter into her arms and weeping. Emma, shell-shocked and devastated, didn't cry. She didn't speak. She barely moved. 2 years passed. Sarah was eventually cleared of all charges and released, but the custody battle that followed was long and complicated. Michael was prosecuted for attempted assault, but served only 18 months due to a lenient plea agreement. Throughout it all, Emma remained silent. Doctors called it selective mutism, a psychological response to severe trauma where a child's anxiety prevents them from speaking in certain situations, or sometimes any situation at all. Emma would eat, sleep, play, and show affection to her grandmother and occasional visits with her mother, but words never came. Her silence was complete and impenetrable. Took Emma to therapists, specialists, and counselors. They all said the same thing. Emma would speak again when she was ready, when she felt truly safe. But time dragged on and Emma's silence persisted. At 3 years old, Emma should have been chattering constantly, asking endless why questions, singing songs she learned at. Instead, she communicated through drawings, gestures, and expressive eyes that held far too much pain for a child. Now, on the morning of the trial, as Emma sat in her grandmother's car on the way to the Denver courthouse, she clutched her stuffed rabbit to her chest. The rabbit had been there that night too, held her granddaughter's small hand and whispered encouragement. "Grandma will be right there with you, sweetheart. You're so brave." But neither of them knew what the day would bring. Neither could have imagined that the broken, silent little girl would become the most important voice in this courtroom. As they walked up the courthouse steps, photographers snapped pictures and news crews positioned themselves expectantly. No one knew her story yet. No one knew that Emma was about to change everything, not through volume, but through the crushing weight of truth finally spoken. Judge had served on the bench for 23 years. She'd presided over countless cases, domestic disputes, financial crimes, violent felonies, and everything in between. But nothing quite prepared her for the motion filed by the prosecution in the case of State v. Michael. They wanted to call Emma, age 3, as a witness, not a character witness, not someone reading a prepared statement, an actual witness expected to testify under oath about the violent incident she'd allegedly witnessed. Judge sat in her chambers on a Thursday afternoon, reading through the motion again and again, her reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. The motion was thick with legal arguments, precedents, and justifications. The prosecution argued that Emma was the only person present during the assault, besides Sarah and Michael themselves, who could testify about what actually happened. Sarah's testimony would be deemed biased, they argued. Michael would obviously deny everything. But a child, in their legal reasoning, represented an untainted witness to the truth. However, the prosecution also noted in their motion that Emma had not spoken a single word in 2 years. She was, by all clinical definitions, selectively mute. This created an impossible legal paradox. How could a witness testify if she couldn't speak? And how could a court determine if such testimony would be reliable, credible, or even admissible? Judge leaned back in her leather chair and rubbed her temples. She'd won awards for her fairness and compassion on the bench. She'd been written up in legal journals for her thoughtful approach to complex cases. But this was uncharted territory. She called a preliminary hearing to discuss the matter with both legal teams. The prosecution team arrived confident and prepared. Lead prosecutor David Lancaster was a sharp man in his 50s, with silver hair and the confidence of someone who'd won most of his cases. He presented his argument clearly. Your Honor, while the defendant's counsel will undoubtedly argue that the witness is unreliable due to her inability to speak, the fact remains that she is the only person who can provide an objective account of what transpired that evening. We have therapeutic evaluations confirming that her mutism is psychologically based, not intellectual. She understands language. She comprehends what's happening around her. With appropriate accommodations and a sensitive approach, she can testify. The defense attorney, Hayes, a formidable woman in her 60s with sharp eyes that missed nothing, stood to counter. Your Honor, with all due respect to my colleague, calling a 3-year-old child to testify, particularly one with documented psychological trauma, is not justice. It's exploitation. This child has already been victimized by the alleged incident. To drag her into a courtroom, to place her in the witness box, to interrogate her about traumatic memories she's clearly repressed or cannot verbalize, that is cruel and unusual, Your Honor. Moreover, how do we even proceed? Do we ask a 3-year-old to swear an oath she cannot possibly understand? Do we cross-examine a traumatized child? This entire proposition violates every principle of protecting vulnerable witnesses, particularly children. Judge listened carefully to both sides, but her mind kept returning to one central question. What was in Emma's best interest? Not the legal system's interest, not justice's interest, Emma's interest. She decided to request a comprehensive evaluation. Over the next 2 weeks, child psychologist doctor was brought in to assess Emma's capabilities. He spent hours with the little girl, documenting her comprehension level, her emotional state, her responses to questioning, and her psychological readiness, if such a thing even existed, to testify. His report was nuanced and complex. Emma, he concluded, was an intellectually normal, bright child. Her silence was entirely psychological, rooted in severe trauma. However, her ability to handle the stress of courtroom testimony was questionable at best. She shows signs of anxiety, hypervigilance, and what appears to be dissociative responses when discussing or being reminded of traumatic events, Doctor wrote. While she may be technically capable of answering questions, the psychological cost of doing so could be significant and long-lasting. This child needs healing and safety, not interrogation. Judge also met privately with Emma's grandmother. The older woman sat in the judge's chambers, her hands trembling as she spoke about her granddaughter. She's been through so much, Your Honor. She watches cartoons but doesn't laugh anymore. She plays with toys but there's no joy in it. She looks at me with these ancient eyes like she's seen things no child should ever see. Please, Your Honor, don't make her relive that night. Isn't there some other way? The judge also spoke with Sarah, Emma's mother. Sarah was torn between two impossible desires, wanting justice for the violence perpetrated against her, but not wanting her daughter to suffer further trauma in pursuing that justice. I just want my baby to be okay, Sarah said through tears. I'd rather let Michael walk free than have Emma hurt more. She's already lost so much. Judge found herself lying awake at night, wrestling with the decision. She thought about precedent. There were cases of very young children testifying, but never under these circumstances. Never a child who couldn't speak, never a child this young, never a case this complex. She consulted with colleagues, reviewed case law, and studied materials on trauma-informed justice. The night before she was scheduled to make her ruling, Judge visited her study at home and pulled out a photograph from her desk drawer. It was a picture of her own granddaughter, Emma, coincidentally sharing the same name as the witness in question. Emma was 5 years old and beaming at the camera, holding a purple lollipop. Judge stared at that image and thought about how vulnerable children were, how they depended on adults to protect them. But then another thought emerged. What if protection meant enabling injustice? What if allowing a guilty man to walk free because she was afraid to challenge the system was its own form of harm, not just to Emma, but to the rule of law itself? The next morning from the bench, Judge delivered her ruling. The courtroom was packed with reporters, attorneys, and observers who sensed they were witnessing something significant. The judge began by acknowledging the unprecedented nature of the situation. She spoke about the delicate balance between protecting vulnerable witnesses and ensuring justice. She discussed the rights of the accused to face his accuser, but also the welfare of children who become entangled in the legal system. After careful consideration of all factors, and with the deepest concern for the well-being of the child involved, this court grants the motion to allow Emma to testify, Judge announced. A murmur ran through the courtroom, some approving, some clearly disapproving. But then she continued, outlining conditions. However, she said firmly, this testimony will occur under carefully controlled circumstances designed to minimize trauma. Accommodations will be made for this child's age and psychological state. The courtroom will be arranged to make her feel as safe as possible. Cross-examination will be limited and carefully supervised. We will not subject this child to the typical adversarial tactics employed in standard testimony. She paused, letting the gravity of her words settle. Furthermore, I am ordering that a trauma-informed professional be present with the witness, and I am considering allowing an emotional support animal in the courtroom if it will help this child feel safe enough to speak. The pursuit of justice cannot come at the expense of a child's. We will find a way to balance both. That final statement, about the emotional support animal, would prove to be the pivot point of the entire case. Doctor's office was nothing like a typical therapist's space. Rather than the austere, professional atmosphere one might expect, it resembled a cross between a playroom and a sanctuary. Soft pastel colors adorned the walls, calming blues and greens that psychologists had determined were most soothing to anxious minds. Shelves lined with toys, art supplies, and books filled every corner. A comfortable seating area featured oversized cushions and a couch soft enough to sink into. In the corner sat a small sand table, various figurines scattered about for children to arrange and rearrange as they pleased. Classical music played softly in the background, barely audible but creating a continuous gentle that eased tension without drawing conscious attention. It was in this space, beginning the day after Judge made her ruling, that Doctor would meet with Emma 3 times a week for the next 8 weeks. Doctor was a man in his early 50s with kind eyes and an unhurried manner that immediately put children at ease. He'd spent the last 25 years specializing in childhood trauma, particularly working with very young children who'd experienced domestic violence. He'd seen cases of selective mutism before, but never one quite like Emma's. The weight of what would be asked of this 3-year-old pressed heavily on his conscience. He'd made his own concerns known in his evaluation, yet here they were, committed to a path that would require Emma to face the very memories she'd suppressed. The first session was tentative and exploratory, brought Emma to Doctor's office on a Monday morning in early December. Emma wore a pink winter coat and held her stuffed rabbit tightly against her chest. She was small for her age, with curls and enormous blue eyes that seemed to take in everything. When she saw the playroom, something flickered in her expression, not quite joy, but perhaps of wariness. Doctor greeted them both warmly. "Hello, Emma. I'm Doctor. This is my office, and I want you to know that this is a safe place. You don't have to do anything you don't want to do here. You can look around, play with anything you'd like, and just be yourself." He looked at. "Grandmother, please make yourself comfortable. You're welcome to stay as long as you'd like, though I find children often feel more at ease if parents and grandparents give them a little space." Understanding his approach, settled into a chair in the corner with a book. She could see Emma but wasn't hovering directly. Emma, released from her grandmother's hand, cautiously moved toward the shelves. She picked up a figurine, a small girl made of plastic, and turned it over in her small hands. She set it down and reached for another toy, a soft rag doll. She brought it to her face and inhaled as if checking for safety. For 45 minutes, Emma explored the room while Doctor narrated what he observed without expectation. "You're touching the soft doll. That doll has been loved by many children. You're looking at the sand table now. Some children like to make patterns in the sand. Some like to bury the figurines. It's up to you what you want to do. He never demanded interaction, never pushed Emma to speak or engage directly with him. He simply created space and filled it with gentle commentary and acceptance. By the end of that first session, Emma had drawn a picture, nothing recognizable, just blue and purple scribbles. Doctor praised it effusively and asked permission to display it on his wall. "It's a beautiful picture, Emma. I'd love to hang it right here so I can see it every time you visit." Emma had looked at her drawing, then at the wall, and nodded once. A small gesture, but significant. Over the following weeks, Doctor employed various therapeutic techniques. Art therapy became a cornerstone of their work. Emma would draw, paint, and create, and Doctor would ask gentle questions about her creations. "Tell me about this blue part," he'd say. Emma couldn't speak, but she could point, could gesture, could show him. Gradually, he introduced storytelling through play. He created scenarios with figurines, a mommy figurine, a child figurine, and other characters. He narrated simple stories and left space for Emma to interact. "The mommy is keeping the child safe," he'd say, watching Emma's response. Slowly, Emma began to participate more actively. She moved the figurines. She rearranged them. She picked certain figures and pushed others away. One day, about 3 weeks into therapy, Emma took the adult male figurine and threw it across the room. The figurine bounced harmlessly off a cushion. Doctor simply said, "That's okay, you're expressing how you feel." He didn't force discussion. He just acknowledged and allowed. Around the 5th week, Doctor introduced a new element to the therapy. During one session, he casually mentioned too, "I've been thinking that a therapy dog might be beneficial for Emma's treatment. Animals have a remarkable ability to help children process trauma without the pressure of speaking. Would you be comfortable with that?" Was initially uncertain. Would an animal distract from Emma's therapy? But she trusted Doctor's expertise. "If you think it will help," she said. The following week, Doctor introduced Daisy. Daisy was a 2-year-old golden retriever who'd been specially trained as a therapy animal. She had kind brown eyes, a gentle temperament, and an uncanny ability to sense when a person needed comfort. The moment Doctor brought Daisy into the session, Emma's entire body language changed. She stiffened, uncertain but also undeniably curious. Dogs represented something, perhaps something threatening, given the courtroom's plan to use a police dog. But Daisy was nothing threatening. She was warmth and softness, an unconditional presence. "This is Daisy," Doctor explained to Emma. "She's a very gentle friend. She likes to be pet and she likes being near people who need comfort. You can touch her if you want, or you can just sit near her. Whatever feels right to you." Emma didn't move at first, but Daisy, reading Emma's emotional state with animal intuition, moved closer to the child and settled on the floor with a soft sigh. The dog rested her head on her paws and looked at Emma with patient eyes. Slowly, tentatively, Emma's small hand reached out and touched Daisy's fur. Her fingers curled into the dog's golden coat. For the first time in the session, her body visibly relaxed. For the next 3 weeks, every session included Daisy. Emma began to anticipate the dog's arrival, her eyes brightening when Doctor went to retrieve her. She would sit with Daisy, running her hands through the dog's coat, sometimes whispering things into the dog's ear that no human could hear. Doctor never pressed. He simply sat nearby, sometimes working with Emma on her art, sometimes just being present. Around week 7, as Emma sat with Daisy, Doctor gently introduced language directly connected to the upcoming trial. "Emma, do you know what a courtroom is?" he asked softly. Emma didn't respond verbally, but she looked at him. "A courtroom is a big room where people go to tell the truth. There will be people sitting in chairs, and there will be a judge, a special person who helps people understand what's true and what's not. I'm thinking about asking Daisy to go to the courtroom with you. Would that help you feel braver?" Emma leaned harder against Daisy, pressing her cheek into the dog's neck. Her hands gripped Daisy's fur more firmly. It was as much of an answer as Doctor needed. In their final session before the trial, Doctor did something unusual. He asked to leave the room for a few minutes. Alone with Emma and Daisy, he sat beside the child and spoke in the quietest, most gentle voice possible. "Emma, I know you haven't talked with words for a very long time, and I know you're scared, but I want you to know something very important. You are so brave. You're braver than big kids. You're braver than grown-ups. And when you're in the courtroom, Daisy will be right there with you. And I'll be there, and your grandmother will be there. You won't be alone." Emma listened, her small hand still in Daisy's fur. "If you can find even just one word to say," Doctor continued, "that would be enough. Just one word. The truth, said in just one word, is more powerful than 1,000 lies, and I believe you have truth inside you that's ready to come out." Emma looked at Doctor, and for a brief moment her lips moved as if she might speak, but no sound came. Doctor simply nodded in understanding and continued stroking Daisy's head. That night, as tucked Emma into bed, she held her granddaughter close and whispered, "Tomorrow is the big day, sweet girl. Doctor believes in you. I believe in you. And I think maybe you believe in you too." Emma fell asleep clutching her stuffed rabbit, Daisy's collar, which Doctor had given to her as a comfort object, held tightly in her other hand. 2 days before the trial was set to begin, Judge issued an order that would ignite a firestorm of legal and ethical debate. The order was brief but bombshell. She approved the use of a certified therapy animal in the courtroom during Emma's testimony. Specifically, she approved Daisy, the golden retriever who'd been working with Emma in Doctor's therapeutic sessions. The news broke immediately. By evening, it had spread across local news stations and legal blogs. The headline on the Denver Legal Journal website screamed, "Judge allows therapy dog in courtroom, unprecedented move in child witness case." Social media erupted with opinions ranging from heartfelt support to fierce condemnation. The defense team was apoplectic. Hayes, Emma's defense attorney, or rather, the attorney defending Michael's right to a fair trial, called an emergency meeting with her team the moment she received the order. They gathered in her corner office on the 42nd floor of a downtown Denver law firm, the city sprawling below them in the late afternoon light. Paced back and forth, her voice tight with anger and strategic concern. "This is prejudicial," she declared. "This is absolutely prejudicial. A police dog in the courtroom. The jury will see that animal and immediately think of protection, authority, law enforcement. They'll connect that dog to legitimacy, to righteousness, to the law itself. And it will be sitting right next to the witness, a 3-year-old child who, I might add, can't even speak to establish basic credibility. This is a setup." Her junior associate, a sharp young woman named Lisa, pulled up research on her laptop. "I'm looking at cases involving animals in courtrooms. There's almost nothing. A few instances where service dogs for disabled witnesses were allowed, but nothing like this. Nothing where the animal is positioned to provide emotional support to a child witness during testimony. This is completely uncharted legal territory." Another team member, the trial strategist, added grimly, "And from a public relations standpoint, we're going to look like monsters if we object too strenuously. We'll be the defense team arguing against a therapeutic dog helping a traumatized 3-year-old. The optics are terrible." Waved her hand dismissively. "The optics don't matter. Justice matters. We need to file an immediate appeal to the state appellate court. We need to argue that this violates the defendant's constitutional right to confront his accuser in a fair and impartial setting. We need to argue that this constitutes judicial bias and prejudicial conduct. We need to argue that any testimony given with an animal present will be tainted and unreliable." She sat down heavily in her leather chair, her strategic mind already formulating arguments. "And we need to argue that a police dog, even one trained as a therapy animal, represents state authority in a way that's fundamentally unfair to the defense. The jury will see law enforcement, not comfort." That same morning, the prosecution team received a copy of the judge's order. David Lancaster read it 3 times, each time with growing satisfaction. He immediately called Doctor. "This is perfect," he told the psychologist. "The judge understands what we've been saying. Emma needs support to testify. This dog will help her feel safe enough to speak. But even within the prosecution's office, there were concerns. A younger prosecutor, eager to build her reputation, voiced hesitation. "Sir, doesn't this seem like it might be manipulative? I mean, strategically, it's brilliant for our case, but isn't there an ethical issue here? Are we using an animal to influence a witness's emotional state in a way that might not be entirely honest?" David Lancaster, who'd been practicing law for 30 years and had won more cases than he'd lost, looked at her with the weariness of experience. Ethics is a luxury in this business. A man attacked a woman with a knife. That's the truth. If a dog helps a traumatized child access that truth so it can be spoken into the record, then the dog is serving justice. Don't overthink it. The media, meanwhile, was having an absolute field day. News vans camped outside the courthouse. Legal analysts debated the decision on television shows. Animal rights advocates praised the judge's compassion. Defense attorneys quoted the decision in their own cases, arguing against its precedent. One prominent legal commentator wrote an opinion piece titled "Dog Days of Justice: Has the Legal System Gone Too Far?" in which she argued that Judge's decision represented a dangerous blurring of the lines between justice and sentiment. The Colorado Defense Attorneys Association issued a formal statement expressing concern about the ruling. "While we respect Judge's commitment to the of child witnesses, we must raise serious questions about whether this decision violates fundamental principles of fair trial rights." The presence of a police-associated animal in the courtroom, positioned directly beside a witness, constitutes a form of implicit endorsement and emotional manipulation that could undermine the integrity of the proceedings. But there was another voice in the conversation that began to emerge: voices from trauma specialists, child psychologists, and domestic violence advocates who supported the judge's decision. Doctor himself gave an interview to a legal podcast. "Judge made a courageous and informed decision," he explained. She recognized that a traumatized child can't access her own voice in a traditional adversarial environment. The presence of a calm, supportive animal doesn't prejudice the defendant. It simply creates the conditions under which truth can emerge. The defendant's right to a fair trial isn't violated by making space for a child to speak her truth. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, Judge was receiving considerable pressure from various quarters. Judicial oversight boards contacted her office expressing concern about her decision. Colleagues reached out to warn her that she might face criticism or even censure if the appellate court overturned her ruling. But Judge, who'd built her career on principled decision-making, remained unmoved. She called Doctor to her chambers. "I want you to understand something," she told him. "I'm aware of the criticism. I know the defense team is appealing this decision. I know legal scholars are questioning my judgment. But I've been a judge for 23 years, and I've learned that law isn't just about rules and procedures. It's about justice. And justice sometimes requires us to innovate, to adapt, to see a situation in a new way." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I've also learned that we often hide behind procedure when we're afraid to do what's right. It's easy to say, well, this is how we've always done it. It's harder to say, what does this particular situation actually require? Emma is not a normal witness. This is not a normal situation. So we need to do something not normal. And yes, that's scary, and yes, it's risky, but it's also correct." The appellate court request was filed, but in an unusual move, the three-judge panel rejected the emergency motion without oral argument. Their one-paragraph opinion simply stated, "This panel declines to overturn the trial judge's discretionary decision regarding courtroom accommodations for a minor witness. Such matters are properly within the trial court's authority." The decision meant one thing: the dog would be allowed in the courtroom. 3 days before the trial, a meeting was held with all parties present to discuss the logistics. Judge had called everyone together: prosecutors, defense attorneys, Emma's grandmother, Doctor, and Officer James, the handler of the police K-9 unit's therapy dog, Daisy. I want to be clear about something. The judge addressed the room. This dog is not here to prejudice anyone. This dog is here because a 3-year-old child needs to feel safe enough to speak truth. Officer, I understand Daisy is not actually a police dog in the traditional sense. Officer, a kind man in his 40s with a calm demeanor, nodded. That's correct, Your Honor. Daisy is trained exclusively for therapy work. She's never been used in law enforcement operations. She has no association with arrest or confrontation. She's trained to provide comfort to traumatized individuals, children, domestic violence survivors, people in crisis situations. She's worked in hospitals, schools, and crisis centers. Hayes interrupted, but she wears a police collar. She's housed in a police facility. The jury will see her as an instrument of state authority. Then we'll remove her collar, Judge said matter-of-factly. She'll wear a simple, neutral leash. She'll be positioned to the side of Emma, not prominently displayed. She's a comfort, not a prop. She's background, not foreground. Any jury member with functioning eyes will understand that this is a child and a dog, not a police action. By the morning of the trial, Daisy had been brought to the courthouse for a final of the courtroom. She needed to become familiar with the space, the sounds, the layout. She was walked through every corner, allowed to investigate, encouraged to relax. Emma and her grandmother were brought in separately to sit exactly where they would sit during testimony. Emma's eyes widened when she saw the courtroom. The high ceilings, the rows of seats, the judge's bench looming above everything. But her hand was held firmly by, and in the corner, Daisy rested on her bed. Tomorrow, Judge told Emma gently, you'll come back here and Daisy will be right there with you, and you'll tell us what you remember. You'll tell the truth, and that will be very brave. Emma didn't speak, but she nodded, and somewhere deep inside her traumatized 3-year-old mind, a seed of possibility began to grow. The morning of the trial dawned cold and gray over Denver. A thick blanket of clouds obscured the sky, and the forecast predicted snow by afternoon. It seemed fitting, a dark, dramatic day for what everyone knew would be a pivotal moment in legal history. News crews had been camped outside the courthouse since before dawn, their satellite trucks lined up like a military convoy, reporters practicing their opening statements to cameras. Inside the courthouse, security was heightened. Metal detectors were positioned at every entrance, and additional officers patrolled the hallways. Judge had issued strict orders about media presence in the courtroom itself. Only a limited number of journalists would be allowed in, seated in the back, under strict rules of conduct. The courtroom needed to remain a sanctuary for the proceedings, not a circus. Emma arrived at 7:30 in the morning, hours before the 9 o'clock start time. Her grandmother had dressed her carefully in a soft pink dress that had sewn herself, with flowers embroidered along the hem. Emma's curls were brushed gently and held back with a delicate headband. She wore her favorite shoes, white Mary Janes that she could slip on and off easily. Had learned through experience that allowing Emma control over small things helped her feel less powerless. But control was something Emma had precious little of this morning. Doctor met them in the courthouse hallway at 8 o'clock. He was dressed more formally than usual, wearing a dark suit and tie, though his expression remained warm and reassuring. "Good morning, Emma. Good morning. Are we ready for our big day?" He crouched down to Emma's eye level. "Remember what we talked about. Daisy will be with you. I'll be in the courtroom. Your grandmother will be right there where you can see her. And the judge, she's a very nice person who wants to hear what you have to say." Emma's small hand reached out and grasped Doctor's hand. She didn't speak, but her grip was firm, a silent communication that she understood, at least on some level, the significance of the moment. Officer appeared around the corner, leading Daisy on a soft leash. The dog moved with the calm grace of a creature trained to sense the emotional state of those around her. When Daisy saw Emma, the dog's entire demeanor softened, if such a thing were possible. Her tail wagged gently, and she approached the little girl with an almost reverent slowness. Emma's face transformed the moment she saw Daisy. For the first time that morning, something like anticipation flickered across her features. She released Doctor's hand and reached out toward the dog. Daisy pressed her head gently against Emma's small body, and Emma buried her fingers in the dog's golden fur. For a long moment, the 3-year-old and the dog simply existed together, finding comfort in each other's presence. "Okay," Doctor said softly, "let's go meet the judge." They made their way through the security checkpoint and down the marble hallway toward the courtroom. With each step, Emma's grip on Daisy's fur tightened. The hallway seemed vast and echoing to a 3-year-old, the sounds of footsteps and distant voices and distorted. Reporters who'd somehow gotten past security tried to approach, calling out questions, but court officers quickly intervened, creating a protective barrier around the small group. The courtroom doors loomed ahead, tall wooden doors with brass handles that looked impossibly large to Emma. Officer pushed one open gently, and they stepped inside. Emma's reaction was visceral. She froze in the doorway, her entire body going rigid. The courtroom was enormous from a child's perspective, a vast cathedral of law and order. The ceiling stretched impossibly high. The judge's bench loomed above like a throne. Rows and rows of wooden seats filled the gallery, and everywhere people, so many people, lawyers in dark suits, a court reporter at her machine, bailiffs in uniform, spectators filling nearly every seat. All of them turned to look at the small child in the pink dress with the golden dog. The courtroom fell utterly silent. Judge, sensing Emma's shock and potential retreat, rose from her seat. Even from her elevated position, her expression was unmistakably kind. "Good morning, Emma," she said in a gentle voice that carried through the courtroom without being loud. "Welcome. I'm Judge. I'm so glad you could come today." She gestured to the area prepared for Emma's testimony. Not the traditional witness box, which would have been positioned too high and felt too formal, but a modified space at ground level where Emma could sit at a comfortable height. Doctor guided Emma forward, one hand on her back, the other still holding Daisy's leash. Followed closely behind, positioned where Emma could see her in her peripheral vision. With each step closer to the designated testimony area, Emma's breathing became shallower. Her small body trembled. The bailiff, a woman named Officer Sarah with a kind face and experienced demeanor, approached carefully. "Hi, Emma, I'm Officer. We have a special place set up for you, okay? It's going to be really comfortable." She'd spread cushions on the floor and arranged a low table with a glass of water and some tissues. Most importantly, there was space for Daisy to settle right beside Emma. Emma was guided to sit on the cushions. Officer positioned Daisy beside her, and immediately the dog pressed against the little girl's side, offering her warmth and weight, grounding presence in a sea of strangeness. Emma wrapped her arm around Daisy's neck and held on as if the dog were the only real thing in the courtroom. The courtroom fell silent again as the bailiff began the oath. This was the first procedural hurdle. Could a 3-year-old child even take an oath? How do you explain the concept of swearing to tell the truth to someone who'd only been alive for 36 months? "Emma," the bailiff said gently, "do you promise to tell the truth?" Emma didn't respond. Her eyes remained fixed on Daisy. The bailiff looked at Judge, uncertain. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Emma, sweetie, do you promise to tell us what you remember, the truth?" Emma's head turned slightly toward the judge. For a moment her blue eyes met the judge's eyes. Then she nodded, just once but definitively. Judge nodded back. "Thank you, Emma, that's all we ask." The prosecutor, David Lancaster, rose from his chair. He approached slowly, careful not to make sudden movements or loud noises. He'd been briefed extensively on how to interact with Emma. No aggressive questioning. No rapid-fire questions. Simple, clear language. Frequent pauses. Acknowledgement of her distress. "Emma," he began, his voice measured and calm, "my name is David Lancaster. I'm going to ask you some questions about the night in your house. The night your mother was there and there was a man. Do you remember that night?" Silence. Nothing but the faint sound of Daisy's breathing and the distant traffic outside the courthouse. Lancaster waited, understanding that silence was not necessarily a refusal. It was often contemplation, processing fear. Emma, that night in your house, was someone there who wasn't supposed to be there. Still silence, but Emma's arm tightened around Daisy's neck. Emma, your mommy was there that night, right? No response but a tiny nod. And Emma, there was another person there. A man. Do you remember the man? Emma's entire body went rigid. Her breathing became audible, quick, shallow breaths. Her hand shook as she held Daisy. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath with her. The prosecutor waited. Seconds stretched into what felt like eternity. Judge watched carefully, ready to intervene if Emma was becoming too distressed. Then Emma leaned down and whispered something into Daisy's ear. Not words, just sounds, emotional release channeled into the dog's soft fur. And when she lifted her head, there was a change in her expression. Something had shifted. As if speaking to Daisy, confessing to Daisy, had opened something locked inside her. Lancaster continued gently. Emma, what did the man do? Did the man do something to your mommy? And then, a sound, barely audible at first, so quiet that some people in the gallery had to lean forward to hear it. Bad, Emma whispered. Her voice was fragile as spun glass, cracked and uncertain from 2 years of disuse. Bad man. The courtroom exploded. Some gasped audibly. Reporters scribbled frantically. A bailiff quickly gestured for them to remain quiet. Judge's eyes widened for just a moment before she regained her composed expression, covered her mouth with her hand, tears streaming down her face. Doctor, standing to the side of the courtroom, closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Emma had spoken. The 3-year-old who hadn't uttered a word in 2 years, who'd locked her voice away in the deepest chambers of her traumatized mind, had finally found it again. It had taken leaving her safe therapist's office, entering a massive, intimidating courtroom, being surrounded by strangers, facing the terror of that terrible night, and the steadfast presence of a golden retriever. But she had spoken. Lancaster, experienced enough to know not to push too hard, simply acknowledged the moment. Thank you for telling me that, Emma. You're very brave. Emma looked down at Daisy, and her fingers stroked the dog's head. In that gesture was relief, gratitude, connection, all the things a small, traumatized child needed to continue finding her voice. The moment had arrived. The impossible had become real. And as the courtroom absorbed what had just happened, everyone understood that nothing would be quite the same after this day. The moment Emma spoke those 2 words, bad man, the entire trajectory of the trial shifted on its axis. What had been a legal proceeding fraught with uncertainty suddenly crystallized into something with the weight of truth. But for Emma, speaking those 2 words was only the beginning of a journey through memory, trauma, and the miraculous process of reclaiming her voice. Prosecutor David Lancaster remained perfectly still, allowing the moment to settle. He understood intuitively that rushing forward would shatter the delicate connection Emma had made with speech. The courtroom, which had erupted in whispers and gasps, was brought back to order by Judge's firm but gentle gaze. Journalists restrained themselves from calling out questions. The bailiff stood sentinel, ensuring silence. Emma, Lancaster said after a long pause, his voice barely above a whisper, you're doing so well. I know this is hard, but you're so brave. Can you tell me more about the bad man? What did the bad man do? Emma's small body remained pressed against Daisy. Her fingers worked through the dog's fur in a repetitive, self-soothing motion. Her lips moved silently for several moments before sound emerged again. When it came, her voice was still barely audible, but it was stronger than before, as if finding that first word had cleared a pathway for others to follow. Bad man hurt mommy, Emma said, the words coming in a rush, tumbling out like water finally released from behind a dam. Hurt mommy. Gasped and covered her face with her hands. Tears streamed down the grandmother's weathered cheeks. Several people in the gallery wiped their own eyes. Even some of the court officers seemed visibly affected by the raw emotion in the child's simple statement. Judge leaned forward slightly, her expression one of intense focus and compassion. She was witnessing something extraordinary, not just the testimony of a witness, but the emergence of a voice that had been stolen by trauma. It was as if the entire courtroom had become sacred ground. "Can you show me how the bad man hurt your mommy?" Lancaster asked carefully. He'd prepared for this possibility, that Emma might need to use gestures or actions to convey what words couldn't fully capture. Emma hesitated. Her eyes darted around the courtroom, taking in the sea of faces watching her. For a moment her courage seemed to waver, but then she looked at Daisy, and the dog pressed her head more firmly against Emma's leg, a physical reassurance, an anchor to safety. Emma reached her small arm toward Lancaster in a mimicking gesture, her hand forming a shape. "Had sharp thing," she said, her voice trembling. "Sharp thing. Mommy scared, I scared." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Sharp thing. A weapon. Lancaster nodded slowly, validating her description. "Thank you for telling me that, Emma. You're being so brave. Did you see the bad man's face? Do you know who the bad man was?" This was the critical moment, the identification that would clinch the prosecution's case or unravel it entirely. Emma's identification of Michael would be crucial, assuming she could make it. Emma's eyes shifted toward the defendant's table, where Michael sat in an ill-fitting suit, his face carefully composed in an expression of confused innocence. The moment Emma's gaze landed on him, the child's body went rigid. Her grip on Daisy intensified to almost painful-looking pressure. A small whimper escaped her lips, not quite a word but a visceral emotional response. "That him," Emma said, pointing with a shaking finger at Michael. "That the bad man hurt Mommy." Michael's attorney, Hayes, immediately rose to object, but the words were already spoken and couldn't be unspoken. Judge overruled the objection before it was fully articulated. The identification had been made, clear, direct, and devastating to the defense. Lancaster continued gently, understanding that Emma's window of verbal capacity might close at any moment. "Emma, what did the bad man say? Do you remember any words the bad man said?" Emma's mouth opened and closed several times. She seemed to be searching her memory, accessing the terrifying vault where she'd stored this trauma. Her breathing became shallow again. Daisy shifted her entire body to align even more fully with Emma, and the dog's calming presence seemed to help the child access deeper memories. "Mommy opened door," Emma recounted, her words becoming slightly more fluid as her mind organized the sequence of events. "Bad man yelling loud. Mommy take me, put me in bed. Bad man still yelling, then, she paused, her small face contorting with the effort of remembering. Then bad man break door, so loud, so scary." The courtroom was utterly silent. Every person present was transfixed by this tiny child's fragmented but viscerally honest account of violence and terror. "What happened next?" Lancaster asked softly. "Mommy scared," Emma continued, her voice becoming slightly stronger as she moved through the narrative. "Mommy hold me. Mommy say be quiet, be quiet. Then bad man come in room. Bad man have sharp thing, long and shiny." She held her small hands apart to indicate length, approximately the length of a kitchen knife. "Mommy push me down," Emma said, her words coming faster now as if her young mind was finally processing what she'd been holding inside for 2 years. "Mommy stand in front of me. Bad man try to get Mommy, they fight. Mommy scream, I scream. Then loud sound, sirens so loud, police come." As Emma spoke, her voice had gradually increased in volume and confidence. She was no longer whispering but speaking in clear, childish tones that carried through the courtroom. The narrative was becoming more detailed, more coherent. The image she was painting was one of a mother protecting her child from a violent attack, of desperate self-defense, of a woman who'd chosen to risk herself rather than let harm come to her baby. Judge, watching this unfold, understood that she was witnessing the truth of what had happened that night being voiced for the first time. Not through sophisticated legal argumentation, not through expert testimony, but through the simple, heartbreaking words of a 3-year-old who'd been there. "Emma," Lancaster said, his voice thick with emotion, "after the police came, what happened?" Emma's face crumpled. Her brave exterior, the fortress she'd built during her testimony, began to crack. "Police take mommy. Police take bad man. Grandma come, I go with grandma. Mommy gone. Mommy been gone so long." The final statement broke something in the courtroom, let out a small sob, and had to be steadied by a court officer. Sarah, Emma's mother, who'd been sitting in the gallery, buried her face in her hands. Several jury members looked visibly shaken. Hayes rose for cross-examination, but even she seemed diminished by what had just transpired. "Emma, isn't it possible that you're confused about what happened? That you misunderstood?" "No," Emma said with surprising firmness, interrupting the attorney. She looked directly at Hayes with eyes far too old for her age. "I remember. Bad man hurt mommy. Mommy protect me." Hayes exchanged a glance with her client, and something shifted in the courtroom's energy. Even the defense seemed to recognize that they were fighting an uphill battle against truth incarnate. Judge called for a brief recess. Emma was carefully guided away from the witness area, her hands still firmly gripping Daisy's fur. As they passed through the courtroom toward the exit, Sarah stood up and called out, "Emma, Emma, Mommy's here." The 3-year-old looked toward her mother's voice, and for a moment the two locked eyes across the courtroom, a moment of reunion so profound that several people in the gallery wept openly. Doctor, following behind, gently guided Emma forward, but he allowed her to turn back one more time to see her mother. Sarah mouthed, "I love you," and Emma's small face transformed with recognition and longing. Back in her safe space with Doctor and Daisy, Emma finally allowed herself to cry deep, wrenching sobs that purged 2 years of silence and trauma. But these were also healing tears, cleansing tears, the tears of a child who'd finally released her burden and placed it into the hands of justice. The trial would continue, but everyone in that courtroom knew its outcome had already been decided, not by legal arguments or procedural maneuvering, but by the simple, devastating truth spoken by a small girl with golden curls and an unbreakable bond with a golden retriever named Daisy. When court reconvened after the afternoon recess, the atmosphere had fundamentally transformed. What had been a trial clouded in uncertainty, that morning had crystallized into something far more transparent. The evidence that the prosecution had been building piece by piece, police reports, photographs of injuries on Sarah, medical examinations, expert testimony about domestic violence patterns, suddenly cohered into a unified, undeniable narrative. But it was Emma's voice that had become the keystone, the element that made all the other pieces fit together in an inescapable configuration of truth. Hayes, the defense attorney, faced an impossible situation. She prepared for a trial where the prosecution would struggle to prove their case beyond the reasonable doubt required for conviction. She prepared to argue that Sarah had acted aggressively, had instigated the confrontation, had used excessive force. She'd prepared to paint Michael as a man trying to reconcile with his ex-partner, a man who'd been met with violence and hostility. But Emma's testimony had blown those arguments to pieces. The prosecutor called his next witness, Detective James, the lead investigator on the case, was a veteran detective with 28 years on the force, precisely the type of credible, authoritative figure that juries trusted. He took the stand and began walking through the physical evidence, the crime scene photographs, the injuries documented on both Sarah and Michael. The defendant had minimal injuries, Detective explained, pointing to photographs projected on a large screen. A few scratches, consistent with defensive contact, but Sarah sustained significant injuries. The screen showed photographs that made several jury members visibly wince. Deep lacerations on Sarah's arms and chest where she tried to shield herself from the knife. bruising around her throat where Michael had attempted to restrain her. A particularly nasty cut on her left shoulder blade, consistent with a knife wound that had been partially deflected by her defensive movements. In my professional assessment, detective concluded, these injuries are consistent with a woman defending herself against an armed attacker, not a woman engaging in mutual combat or aggression. The defense cross-examination was brief and ineffectual. Hayes had little ammunition left. Michael's own injuries were so minor that arguing he'd been the victim would only undermine her credibility with the jury. More witnesses followed. A forensic analyst about the knife. Michael's fingerprints were all over it. Witnesses from the apartment complex they'd heard screaming and sounds of struggle. A neighbor described hearing Sarah's voice calling for help and mentioning her child. Each witness, each piece of evidence, accumulated like snow on a winter morning, building into something impossible to ignore. But it was during the prosecution's final witness, a domestic violence psychologist, that the broader picture emerged with devastating clarity. Dr. Helena, a woman in her 60s with decades of experience working with domestic violence cases, took the stand and provided testimony that contextualized everything that had happened that night. She explained the patterns of intimate partner violence, the psychology of perpetrators who couldn't accept rejection, the particular dangerousness of men who escalated to weapons. Michael violated a protective order multiple times, Doctor explained. He was becoming increasingly unstable, increasingly obsessed with his ex-partner. The introduction of a weapon, the late-night invasion of her home, the violence, these are hallmarks of a perpetrator who's reached a critical escalation point. This wasn't a random incident. This was the culmination of a pattern of control and intimidation. She paused, allowing her words to sink in. And the presence of the child, his ex-partner's child, who he had no biological connection to, is particularly significant. Men like this often use children as leverage, as motivators. He may have believed that threatening the child or harming her mother in front of her would give him power or control. The fact that the mother immediately positioned herself between the attacker and the child is textbook protective instinct. The defense had nothing to counter this testimony. Michael's attorney made motions to suppress certain evidence, challenged the admissibility of expert testimony, and went through all the procedural motions required of a competent defense attorney. But everyone in the courtroom understood that these were the desperate gestures of someone fighting an unwinnable battle. Then came the moment when the courtroom itself seemed to shift on its axis. Judge called Michael to the stand. The defendant had the right to testify or to remain silent, and his attorney had been coaching him extensively on how to present himself. Michael took the stand in his ill-fitting suit, his hair combed neatly, his expression carefully neutral. He'd been prepped to appear remorseful, confused, misunderstood. But the prosecutor, David Lancaster, was ruthless. "Mister, you violated the protective order against you multiple times in the months before this incident. Isn't that correct?" Michael hesitated. His attorney had prepared him for this question, had told him to admit it but frame it sympathetically. "I was trying to talk to Sarah. I wanted to reconcile. I made mistakes." "You showed up at her workplace," Lancaster interrupted. "I just wanted to." "You followed her to a grocery store." "I was trying to." "And on the night in question, you broke down her door at 9:30 in the evening, carrying a kitchen knife." Michael's carefully constructed composure began to crack. His jaw tightened. His eyes hardened. For just a moment the mask slipped, and the jury saw something darker underneath, something that aligned perfectly with the narrative the prosecution had been building. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," Michael said, but his voice had changed. It was no longer the rehearsed tone of someone following legal advice. It was defensive, resentful. "She had no right to keep my child from me. That's my daughter." "She's not your daughter," Lancaster said flatly. "Emma is Sarah's daughter. You have no biological relationship to her, and you've never had parental rights over her. And you knew you weren't supposed to be anywhere near them. You had a protective order. That order was unfair. And yet you violated it repeatedly, and then you broke into her home with a knife. Why? Michael's face flushed with anger. Because I loved Sarah, because she had no right to keep me away. His response hung in the air, a confession of sorts, an admission that his motivation had been possessiveness, not love. The jury exchanged glances. Several wrote notes. When Michael stepped down from the stand, something essential had shifted. His testimony had actually strengthened the prosecution's case by revealing his anger, his sense of entitlement, his refusal to accept boundaries. The closing arguments came the following day. The prosecutor painted a picture of a violent man escalating, crossing lines repeatedly, finally committing an act of desperation born from the rejection of a woman who tried to build a life away from him. The defense attorney, reduced to grasping at straws, attempted to argue for lesser charges, for mitigating circumstances, for the jury's compassion. But then the prosecutor said something that seemed to encapsulate the entire trial. You heard from a 3-year-old child who couldn't speak until she was in this courtroom. Emma had been silenced by trauma, but when she needed to speak the truth, when justice required her voice, she found it. She looked across this courtroom and identified the man who attacked her mother. She told you, in the simple words of a child, what happened that night. Ladies, and the truth doesn't require eloquence. It doesn't require sophisticated legal arguments. It requires courage. And Emma has shown us more courage than most adults will ever show in their entire lives. The jury deliberated for 5 hours. When they returned with their verdict, the courtroom was packed to capacity. News vans surrounded the building. The nation had been following this case with rapt attention, a case that had become a symbol of justice, of trauma recovery, of the power of truth. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, how do you find? Guilty, the jury foreman said, her voice steady and clear. The courtroom erupted. Some people cried. Some people cheered. Hayes immediately began planning her appeal, but even she understood that this verdict would likely withstand scrutiny. Emma wasn't in the courtroom for the verdict. Doctor had kept her protected, away from the spectacle. But when Sarah learned that she'd been acquitted of all charges and that her attacker had been convicted, she immediately asked to see her daughter. Brought Emma to a private room where her mother was waiting. When Emma saw Sarah, the 3-year-old's face transformed with joy and recognition. "Mommy," she cried, the word, which had been locked away for 2 years, now flowing freely and easily. "Mommy." Sarah swept her daughter into her arms and held her as if she'd never let go again. Behind them, Doctor stood with tears streaming down his face. Daisy, who'd been brought along as Emma's constant companion, rested her golden head against both of them. Justice had been served, but more than that, a family had been restored. Retrial 6 months after the verdict, Emma sat in the grass of Washington Park in Denver, her small hand buried in Daisy's golden fur. Around them, the world was awakening to spring. New leaves unfurled on trees. Flowers bloomed in vibrant colors. Children played on the grass nearby, their laughter carried on the warm breeze. Emma watched them with interest, still quiet by nature, but no longer silent by trauma. "Can I go play?" Emma asked her mother, who sat on a nearby bench watching them both with the protective gaze of someone who'd nearly lost everything. Sarah smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes, something that had been rare in her life not so long ago. "Of course, baby, go play. Mommy will be right here." Emma scrambled to her feet and began running toward the playground, Daisy following at a gentle trot. The dog had become as much a part of Emma's life as her stuffed rabbit. After the trial, when Officer had asked if Emma would like to continue seeing Daisy, there'd been no hesitation. Emma had formed an attachment to the dog that transcended typical pet ownership. Daisy represented safety, comfort, and the bridge between Emma's traumatized silence and her emerging voice. Sarah watched her daughter play, actually play with joy and lightness, and allowed herself to cry happy tears. 2 years ago, she'd been arrested. She'd lost custody of her daughter. She'd been entangled in a legal system that had seemed designed to punish her for being a victim. The scars on her body had healed, but the psychological wounds had run deeper. She'd questioned whether she'd ever get her daughter back, whether Emma would ever recover from the trauma of that terrible night. But here they were, together, healing. The case of State v. Michael had become a landmark decision in Colorado jurisprudence. In the months following the verdict, Judge received inquiries from judges across the country asking about her decision to allow Daisy in the courtroom. Legal scholars published papers analyzing the implications. The case became required reading in several law schools' courses on evidence and child witnesses. Most significantly, the Colorado Supreme Court issued new guidelines for handling child witnesses in traumatic situations. The guidelines, which became known informally as the Emma Protocol, established that trauma-informed accommodations, including the use of certified therapy animals, modified courtroom environments, and specialized questioning techniques, could be employed when in the best interest of justice and the child's. Judge had been nominated for a national award recognizing judicial innovation. She'd accepted the award but insisted on sharing it with Officer James and Daisy herself, much to the amusement of the award ceremony organizers. In her acceptance speech, she talked about the importance of judges remaining flexible, of being willing to challenge tradition when justice demanded it. "Emma taught us all a lesson," Judge had said, her voice carrying through the auditorium. "She taught us that truth doesn't require the trappings of formality. It requires only courage and safety. Every child who walks into a courtroom after this case will benefit from what Emma endured. Her suffering will have meaning because we're choosing to learn from it and do better." Doctor had published a paper titled Selective Mutism and Trauma Recovery: The Role of Non-Human Companions in Facilitating Speech, that had been cited in over 200 subsequent academic works. He'd expanded his therapy practice and begun training other therapists in trauma-informed approaches that incorporated animal therapy. Every month, he received letters from other child therapists thanking him for the work he'd done with Emma, crediting her case with inspiring them to pursue similar approaches with their own traumatized patients. Officer James had become a national advocate for therapy animals in law enforcement. He'd given countless presentations about Daisy's work and had helped establish a national database of therapy dogs available to courts for child witnesses. The Denver Police Department had expanded its therapy dog program from 1 dog to 5, and other departments across the country had followed suit, creating their own programs based on the model established in Denver. Most remarkably, Daisy had become something of a celebrity. She appeared in a documentary about the trial that had won critical acclaim. Children's books had been written about her. She'd been profiled in major magazines. But despite the attention, she remained exactly what she'd always been: a gentle, compassionate animal who simply wanted to help those in pain. Sarah had rebuilding her life with determination and grace. The custody battle that followed the trial had been relatively swift. The judge, unsurprised by the verdict against Michael, had ruled in Sarah's favor almost immediately. Sarah had kept her job at the medical clinic and had begun working with a domestic violence advocacy organization, helping other women who'd experienced intimate partner violence navigate the legal system. "I want to be the person I needed when I was going through this," Sarah told an interviewer who'd asked about her new work. "I want to help other women know that there are people who believe them, who will fight for them, who understand what they're going through." Emma had continued her therapy with Doctor twice a week. While her selective mutism had resolved, the underlying trauma required ongoing processing. She still had nightmares occasionally. She was still sometimes anxious in loud, chaotic environments, but she was also, increasingly, a normal 3-year-old. She sang songs. She told jokes. She asked endless why questions. She colored pictures and built block towers, and loved her mother with the fierce, uncomplicated devotion that only a small child can offer. 1 year after the trial, Sarah and Emma attended a special ceremony at the courthouse. Judge had organized it to celebrate the case's 1-year anniversary and to formally thank all the people involved. Emma, now 4 years old and wearing a dress she'd picked out herself, stood between her mother and grandmother as she was presented with a plaque recognizing her bravery in the pursuit of justice. Emma couldn't read the plaque, of course, but she understood that she was being honored. She beamed with pride and held Daisy's collar as cameras flashed and people applauded. "I want to say something," Judge announced, and the room fell silent. 1 year ago, we all witnessed something remarkable. We witnessed a traumatized child find her voice in the most difficult circumstances imaginable. But what we're celebrating today isn't really about one case. It's about what that case has inspired, a fundamental shift in how we think about justice for children. She looked directly at Emma. "Emma, you couldn't speak for 2 years, but when you did speak, you spoke truth. And that truth changed everything. It changed this courtroom. It changed our legal system. It inspired people across this country to think differently about how we protect vulnerable witnesses. You were so brave, Emma. And because of your bravery, the next child who goes through what you went through will have it easier. You've made the world better." Emma, understanding at least the emotional gist of what the judge was saying, reached up and hugged Daisy tightly, burying her face in the dog's golden fur. The room erupted in applause. That evening, as Sarah tucked Emma into bed, the little girl asked a question that made her mother's heart both break and soar. "Mommy, why was I scared to talk before?" Sarah sat on the edge of the bed and chose her words carefully. "Because something very scary happened, baby. Something that wasn't your fault. But you were so brave and you talked when it was important. And now you talk all the time. You're all better now." Emma considered this with the gravity that only a young child can bring to profound matters. "I'm glad I talked. Talking is good." "Yes, baby," Sarah agreed, stroking her daughter's hair. "Talking is very good." Years later, when Emma was older, she would understand the full magnitude of what had happened in that courtroom. She would read about the case in school. She would understand that she'd been at the center of something significant. But for now, at age 4, she simply knew that she was safe, that her mother was safe, that Daisy was always nearby, and that her words, had made a difference. Michael served 15 years in prison before being released on parole. The protective order against him was made permanent. He was required to undergo anger management and domestic violence counseling. He would never know that his victim and his accuser had not just survived their encounter with him, but had transformed it into something that helped countless other people. Emma grew up to be a compassionate, articulate woman. She became a therapist herself, specializing in childhood trauma. She wrote a memoir about her experiences. She advocated for trauma-informed justice practices, and throughout her life, she maintained her connection to Daisy, who aged gracefully into her golden years, still offering comfort and companionship to the girl who needed her most. Judge retired 15 years after the trial, having established herself as a pioneer in trauma-informed justice. She spent her retirement writing about her experiences and mentoring young judges. She remained close to the family and was godmother to Emma's own children, who grew up hearing the story of how their mother had found her voice. The legacy of Emma's 2 words "bad man" extended far beyond that courtroom in Denver. It rippled outward, changing policies, inspiring innovations, transforming how the legal system approached vulnerable witnesses. It proved that justice doesn't always require complexity. Sometimes, it simply requires courage, safety, and the willingness to listen to truth, no matter how small or fragile its voice. And it all began with a 3-year-old girl, a golden retriever, and a judge who believed that justice could be compassionate without being compromised. Retry can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.